Some people believe it's the burial shroud of Jesus, a forensically accurate imprint of the crucifixion, bearing Christ's image, stained with his blood.
The only conclusion I can come to, this is the real thing.
Others are just as certain it's not.
The Shroud of Turin is the work of a confessed forger, period.
The real thing or a fake? Even modern science can't seem to find the definitive answer.
It is either the most remarkable forgery of all time or something very, very remarkable happened 2,000 years ago.
If it's a forgery, how was it done? And if it's the burial cloth of Jesus, does it confirm the faith or shatter it? It's one of Christendom's most precious relics. A piece of herringbone linen that's just over 14 feet long and 3.5 feet wide. The cloth isn't pretty to look at. It's been scarred, burned, stained, and patched. What makes it unusual is the image it bears on its surface. A shadow so faint, it seems to disappear when you approach. But if you look at it from a distance, you can make out the ghostly silhouette of a man, seen from both the front and the back. A man who appears to have been beaten, stabbed, and crucified. For the past 150 years, the cloth has been housed inside the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in the Italian city of Turin, which is where it gets its name, the Shroud of Turin. But just what exactly the Shroud of Turin is remains the subject of an ongoing, passionate debate. Is it the actual burial shroud of Jesus, or is it a fake?
Every responsible and legitimate scientist who knows anything about the shroud accepts it as an artistic representation made during the 14th century.
It is just out of character with any art that one finds from Middle Ages, Renaissance, anything like that.
The shroud first came to light in the mid-14th century, when it showed up at a small church in the French town of Liry. If anyone knew where it came from, they never said.
New churches were actually, by canonical law, required at some point to have relics. So we see entire churches being built to house a crown of thorns or a holy shroud.
Like the cross and the crown of thorns, Jesus' burial shroud was a familiar artifact to medieval Christians. All four Gospels mention it. The Bible tells us that after the crucifixion, Jesus was carried to a nearby tomb, where he was prepared for burial. We're told this was done according to Jewish custom, but the Bible doesn't say what that custom was, except that Jesus was covered with a linen cloth. The Bible also says that large amounts of aloe and myrrh were brought in to anoint the body. Then, 2 days after the crucifixion, came the transforming event that launched a new religion. Christians believe that on Easter Sunday morning, Jesus rose from the dead, although the Gospels never explicitly say so. They just tell us that the tomb was left empty, except for one or more pieces of linen. Is it possible that the resurrection somehow produced an imprint on the burial cloth? Most of those who believe the shroud is authentic think the answer is yes.
The simplest answer is generally the correct one. And in this case, frankly, the simplest answer is this cloth wrapped this man's body, and it's an artifact of that event.
Skeptics wonder why the Gospels never mention that an image of Jesus was left on the cloth.
What a thing to leave out. Oh, by the way, there was this incredible portrait of him that appeared on it.
But if the Shroud of Turin is actually Christ's burial cloth, it must have gone underground for the next 13 centuries. Because the next time we hear of it, the shroud is turned up in the hands of a French crusader recently returned from the Holy Land. His family later gave it to the church in Leary, and the shroud's celebrity status took off from there. Pilgrims flocked to Leary to gaze on the mysterious image and be amazed. Eventually, the shroud became so popular, it had to go on tour. At each stop, local clerics held it aloft to reverent crowds. Medieval artists who saw the shroud tried to copy it, with very limited success. But not everyone at the time was convinced the shroud was genuine. Even a local bishop was skeptical, according to something called the Darcy Memorandum.
The bishop's report to Pope Clement, dated 1389, tells about his predecessor having found the artist who had painted it, that the forger was found and confessed.
But this incident in the shroud's history may just as easily be a simple matter of ecclesiastical envy.
It seems to be a case of a bishop coming across this extraordinary relic and saying, this cannot be authentic, only the highest princes own something like this, and so it's got to be a forgery.
At any rate, that's where the matter ended. The forger was never named, and there was no explanation about how he had achieved his stunning results. Which is unfortunate, because to this day, no one can say with any assurance how the forger did it, though there's no shortage of theories. Depending on which skeptic you talk to, the forger got his results either by painting on linen or painting on glass. He may have used a shallow kind of statue called a bas-relief. It's even possible he used a corpse. In some theories, forensic accuracy required the use of a live body with accessories. Some researchers have suggested that the shroud might be a medieval photograph, perhaps one of Leonardo da Vinci's less publicized experiments. Which brings us to one of the shroud's many unusual qualities. Something happens when you take a picture of it. The first person to notice this phenomenon was an Italian lawyer named Secondo Pia, who was chosen to take the first photographs of the shroud in 1898. As his plates emerged from the negative bath, he saw the image with the lights and darks reversed. It looked to him, uncannily, like a photograph, made from a negative, which in this case was the shroud itself. But the skeptics aren't buying it.
It isn't a photographic negative at all.
It is not a perfect photonegative unless Jesus was an albino with white hair and a white beard and a white mustache.
It looks like a white-haired and white-bearded old man. Well, was Jesus an albino? Was he a white-bearded old guy? No.
In the enhanced image, shroud believers saw a host of telltale signs. the bruise under the eye, dumbbell-shaped marks on the back and legs, blood flows on the forearms and the small of the back, a splotch of blood on the wrist. Then, 34 years later, more pictures were taken during the Shroud's popular exhibition in 1931. But it wasn't until 1978 that the Shroud was put to the ultimate test. An examination by 24 mostly American researchers with all their fancy modern equipment. They called themselves the Shroud of Turin Research Project, or STURP. They would have the Shroud for 5 straight days to take their measurements and run their tests. Their task, to figure out how the image was formed. The STURP team gathered in Turin in October of 1978. Barry Schwartz was the group's official photographer.
When I was first asked to be a member of this team, my first response was, but I'm Jewish. And being a Jew, I thought, well, this is another one of those things I'm not really that interested in.
Schwartz's first encounter with the Shroud wasn't what he expected.
The cloth was pliable and soft, so I think there was maybe an initial surprise, gee, this is in better shape than we thought it would be.
Then there was the matter of the image itself.
Frankly, I was expecting to see the paint and the brushstrokes and come home. And it took all of about 2 minutes for me to realize that whatever this thing was, this was no painting.
Aside from the image, the most obvious marks on the Shroud were a series of burns and patches, the result of a church fire in 1532. The Shroud we see today is actually several different pieces of cloth. There's the original image-bearing linen shroud, the patches sewn on after the 1532 fire, and the Holland cloth, attached as a backing to stabilize it. For 5 days, the STURP team examined the Shroud and then spent months studying the results. And their conclusion?
The image is not a photograph, not a painting, not an artwork.
Although most of STURP's research was published in peer-reviewed journals, critics questioned the team's competence and their motives.
They didn't know anything at all about art forgeries and pigments and so forth.
I could see right from the newspaper reports that these people were all biased toward authenticity.
Critics pointed to the one dissenting voice from the STURP team, Dr. Walter Macron, a renowned microscopist. Although he didn't go to Turin, Macron was sent fiber samples gathered on sticky tape, and when he examined them, he found
red ochre pigment and probably in a collagen tempera binder.
And he quickly came to the conclusion that the image areas of the Shroud were covered by millions of tiny red ochre pigment particles.
In other words, paint. So Macron concluded the Shroud was simply a medieval painting, probably done freehand. Shroud believers think Macron was mistaken.
There's no paint or pigment in the areas of the image. The image is only on the surface of the fibrils, and it does not go very deep into the cloth.
Shroud believers also claim that whatever small amount of paint there is on the Shroud probably got there as the result of an accepted practice when creating replicas.
There are 52 documented occasions where artists were permitted to view the Shroud, create a replica or painting of it, and then they were allowed to lay their artwork onto the cloth to sanctify the artwork. Because he found these few particles of red paint, Waldrich then claimed that the entire shroud is a painting, without taking into account the vast amount of other data that showed that it wasn't a painting.
That other data included the intriguing results when the shroud image was fed into something called a VP8 analyzer, a computer that converts image density into a topographical relief.
And lo and behold, the result is the natural relief of a human form. The image density is directly proportionate to the distance the cloth was from the